Hello and welcome back to the Cave Escape. I'm Ashton Goolsby.
And I'm Caleb Groves.
And today we are continuing our further discussion of classical education with the book The Liberal Arts Tradition, A Philosophy of Christian Classical Education by Kevin Clark and Ravi Scott Jain, I think is how you say his name.
I would assume that's how you say it.
So we talked last time again about the trivium and kind of how some of our understanding has changed of it after talking to Mr. Wilbur and reading this book.
Mm.
And this week we're going to look at the Quadrivium again. And I get excited every time to talk about the Quadrivium just because they take it to such an it just builds everything.
Yeah.
And then I like this time the focus they put on at the end, pointing it toward the next arts would be philosophy and theology.
Yeah, that's one thing. I've loved the way this whole thing,
Mm-hmm.
like as they've described each stage of their paradigm, they've like kind of made it flow, like they show how it flows naturally into the next stage of their PG mapped paradigm that they've developed.
PG Mapped sounds like a TV show or something. I don't know.
Or a rapper. That's a bad rapper name. Pretend I didn't say that.
Anyway. So they begin their section here with a quote from Philolaus the Pythagorean. It says, "All things that can be known have number, for it is not possible without number anything can either be conceived or known," which is kind of the point of this whole section, is just understanding number. And that was even something Mr. Wilbur talked about. But I almost felt like, if possible, they were on it more as we went through.
Yeah. Like everything is number. In a way that almost feels like not even intuitive beyond like what the way that Mr. Wilbur phrased it. Because I don't know, it's also partially the way Mr. Wilbur talks is just like everything that he says just seems to make perfect sense and be absolute like eternal truth or something. But yeah, like the way they phrased everything was in number the whole time. And it was like the whole time this is how this is going back to number, and everything was math. They used the words math and mathematical like a ton in every section.
Mm-hmm.
And I also thought it was cool. It was super interesting how they, sort of like when Mr. Wilbur was talking about it, like it just kind of like flows into each one.
Mm-hmm.
Like one into there, specifically astronomy and music. Where they talked about music in the astronomy section a lot, and then they talked about astronomy in the music section a lot.
Yes.
Which I thought was super interesting.
But even their arithmetic and geometry went tied over.
Yeah. Also, with this beginning quote, that all things that can be known have number, because it's not possible that anything without number can be conceived or known, is like, I was thinking about what that actually means and why that is a thing that makes sense. And I don't remember, I think this was in arithmetic class. I don't remember which book it was though. But I guess it would be epistemology. But something Aristotle said somewhere, I think, where like we know things by there being other. Like we know things like the difference between same and other, and like we know that the reason we can know anything is because we can see there's that and there's this other thing which is other to that thing.
I feel like they did point that out somewhere in here. I just can't remember.
Okay, maybe they did.
Maybe we'll find it as we go. The other thing I felt like we got it again reading the book, but from a slightly different perspective from Mr. Wilbur. Because Mr. Wilbur is very good at highlighting the beauty of it. And so when he puts it out, I feel very much the beauty of studying things just because they're beautiful and they're true.
Yeah.
But they got more, I felt like, into some more, like, not that they disregarded the beauty of it, but they got more into the technicality, possibly, of math and as it relates up. I felt like I saw the math more, which is helpful because I'm not a math person.
Oh, yeah.
I was that guy that he was quoted in that one section saying, when given the choice between studying math and Latin or Greek, I chose Latin or Greek, and I think I'm poorer for it.
Yeah.
And I was not ready to make that decision. I would have made the same decision, but was kind of forced otherwise.
Nice.
I like his I like up here where they talk about the way understanding the Quadrivium this way is the mathematical arts it frees us in a sense from Gnosticism.
Mm-hmm.
I have underlined here the material realm was no longer after the Christian influence of the early church. The material realm was no longer seen as inherently sinful and unruly, as the Gnostics suggested. Instead, it was possible for the realm of nature to be perfectly ordered and even combined with the realm of spirit of mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of the Greeks before saw math as almost this transcendental thing because the flesh and material things they're icky.
Right.
But then Christ coming and becoming man, but he's God, gave us this idea of, well, the flesh can't be that bad if God himself is willing to become flesh and die, but then be resurrected, and we're going to be resurrected again. It changes the way you think of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not, the Quadrivium's not studying just paganism. It's reformed paganism. The Christians took it and said, there's something good you're looking for here. And then they adjusted it for Christianity to realize even more of the glory of God.
Was that so in the book? I feel like I remember that being kind of more like the ancients thought of it as like there are these perfect, like the forms of things, and so these are like the perfect things that exist imperfectly in like reality or physical reality. There's like these perfect ideals that don't actually exist except as ideals. And math kind of like fell into that category. And so everything that we see and everything that's a part of our perception is what they thought of as kind of being unruly and evil. But then, or I don't know about evil. And so does that mean that when the Christians, like you said, like adapted it or whatever, that the math, they changed the math slightly to be less perfect to fit with the world?
Do you think the Christians did?
Yeah, or like how does that like, so because what you just said a second ago, when you said they thought of it this way, but then Christians adapted it to fit with their new worldview.
Well,
Does that just mean that like the way that they thought about the world made it so that the world wasn't imperfect?
I think that seems to be kind of what it's saying, because it says instead it was possible for the realm of nature to be perfectly ordered and even combined with the realm of spirit or mathematics. So I think it's this idea of the Greeks thought of the world's imperfect, it's not good, but then we realize everything was created perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Christ is perfecting the world. Therefore, we can, in a sense, understand nature using these quote-unquote perfect laws of mathematics because, I mean, it was created perfect and it is being perfected. That's how I understood it. I mean, you can...
I guess that makes sense. I was just thinking, because I don't think that the universe is perfect anymore. Like, I think that God created it with, like, everything had perfect proportions, but now, because the way that it is, everything's, like, almost. Like the Pythagorean comma with, like, music tuning. And, like, if you do fifths, then you end up with not actually the same note, like 5 octaves above or whatever. I don't actually know the number. And so it's because it's just, like, slightly off. Or, like, the orbits of the planets are, like, almost, I forget which ones it is, something like Mars to Saturn or something, the ratio of their orbits is like almost exactly the ratio of 3-2, but not quite. And several other there's like a lot of ratios and proportions in creation that are like almost perfect proportions, but not quite. And I think I think that happened at the fall, and that prior to that everything was in perfect proportion with each other.
There's also, I kind of think that to me is part of the beauty of the created order, though. We know these perfect intervals, but they're off ever so slightly in a way that we can get really close to it, but we can't exactly get to it. So it's one of those the way I view it is that speaks in my mind to even more the beauty and eternality of God, whereas we can conceive of it, and right as soon as we get there, we realize we're not actually there yet. Does that make sense? So we
Yes.
expect it to be one way, but because it in a sense, like God Himself transcends our understanding, we think, yes, half of this should be an exact octave, all right, and then a third of this should be a fifth exactly, and we can
Mm-hmm.
work this math out and continue. And so we do it perfectly according to the rules, and then we get up there and realize something's off, and we can't account for it somehow. But when we hear it working correctly, it's beautiful. But we still, as close as we can get, can't quite grasp it.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, I don't necessarily understand it. I'm not necessarily saying it wasn't a result of the fall, but to me, it almost is more beautiful because it's not quite so cut and dry. I guess perfect as we've labeled
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. But then I think it's more beautiful because it points to that reality of us not being able to like fully grasp who God is.
Mm-hmm.
But like that our relationship with God, or like with knowledge of God, I guess maybe, will be different like in the new heavens and new earth.
Mm-hmm.
Because we'll be with him. And we'll like actually be in his presence.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if that the reflection of that in created order would also be different, and we would have the more, like if we would have the quote unquote perfect proportions there.
Yeah.
Or not, because I mean at the same time, like we're not going to know God in his fullness at that point either, because he's still infinite and we'll still be finite, so we'll still be like learning about him for eternity.
That's the beauty of it.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know, that's a very good point. I've not really thought about that.
Yeah, that was one thing I remember talking about cosmology, and then going back and talking with my dad about it, and I think somebody else at one point too. Thinking, is it necessarily? I don't know, I'm trying to think of the way to say it. Could it not have been in the beginning this way? And it's intriguing to me that we can't necessarily have perfect Pythagorean tuning
Mm-hmm.
in the way that we want to try to do music now, because we know how it should work, yet when we try it, it for some reason is off.
Yeah.
And it just escapes us, and it's frustrating, but it also, not in the sense of I'm just angry and I want to leave it off to the side. I'm frustrated, but I want to keep going back to it and trying to figure out why.
Yeah.
So to me, and I guess it's not a hill that I'm necessarily willing to die on one way or the other, because I don't
Right.
know.
Yeah.
But to me, I almost wonder, was it created that way just so that it ever so slightly, it would seem, eludes us?
Mm-hmm.
Because it gives us more wonder at a God who can create something like that we can come so close, it feels like, to comprehending, and yet still not understand it.
Yeah.
Which, to me, again, as a non-mathematician,
Mm-hmm.
I'm learning to appreciate math, and so that's an area where I'm just like, that gives me kind of that awe and wonder they were talking about
Mm-hmm.
in here about having math and just kind of wondering at it, which we don't do anymore.
Yeah.
For me, that's part of it, is we can do so much with it, and yet there's so much we just don't understand about it.
Yeah. And so why do you think the idea of created order being a good thing and still being able to be explained with the perfect mathematical proportions and everything, like we were saying before, why do you think that didn't come about until Jesus? Like why was that not able to be understood before Jesus, if like everything we just said about it's beautiful because it points to how infinite God is and how we can't quite grasp the fullness of what he is, Because that would have existed before Christ, right? That idea.
That
That God can't be fully grasped.
Yeah.
So why was it not until Jesus came now, because we've had this revelation, we can reconcile these like ideals of math that prior to Jesus we didn't think could actually exist in the real world, and now we can say they do.
That would be because it's a Greek idea. This way of thinking about math, because they're the ones who really delved into the mathematical and things this way. But there were Gnostics, believing basically that, like you're saying, the forms, there's these ideal forms
Right,
of things that exist in the transcendental, but they can't exist in physical because the physical world is gross and is to be avoided. And actually, the highest ideal is just to escape the physical realm and be purely spiritual.
Yeah.
But Christianity rejects that notion.
Okay, gotcha.
So the math exists in the spiritual because we are spiritual, but also it's a physical reality too because we're also physical. God created the physical world and declared it good.
Yeah.
So obviously it has to be logical, and the math applies there too,
Right.
because God said the creation was good when he made it.
Mm-hmm.
So it obeys those same laws.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I was thinking about it like, for some reason I wasn't connecting that it was like pagan Greeks believed this thing, and then Christians took up what the pagans said and changed it. So that makes sense. I'm just dumb.
Horde slate.
So arithmetic.
They broke out the triangle and cube numbers again. Like
I know,
Mr. Robert
yeah.
talked about.
That was cool. Yeah, we needed to make sure that we don't repeat stuff that we said in the other one.
Yeah.
Which it'll be hard because we had Mr. Wilbert explain it last time.
I'll say that with them talking about the triangular and the square numbers again, after we talked to Mr. Wilbur, my class actually, it was like the first week back after Christmas, they were doing squaring numbers. And I remember last year it was a little hard to get some of them to conceive of what we were trying to do, but I tried to draw it out for them this way just from the beginning, and they seemed to get it, and we're like, okay. And then we went back to the way the book wanted them to do it, and I think it helped them. But then I also drew them out the triangular numbers, and they got it like that.
Really?
And then I was like, I was like, okay, so what would the next one be? And they're like, 10? Like, yes. What would the next one be? 15? They said, well, you just add, if the bottom row was 4 last time, then we'll just add 5 to the bottom, then we get the next one up, and then the next one we add 6, and we get the next one up would be 21. I was like, yeah, y'all got that pretty quick. So.
And then did you go back to squares and they got the squares, or were they still
we done squares first, and I said, fun fact, they also thought there were triangular numbers too.
Okay.
And they got it pretty. They seemed pretty intrigued by that.
That's cool.
That was fun.
I wish we used triangular numbers more.
Well, it is the strongest shape.
That is true.
Strongest two-dimensional shape.
So this was a cool line that I noticed was, they said, according to Augustine, a science can be purely in the mind, and imitation can be done without reason, but only humans can join imitation with reason to create an art.
Yeah, that was it. I underlined that too.
Yeah. I just think the idea of joining imitation and reason, and that being what creates art, is super fascinating.
Well, I
just thought it was weird that they were like, but only humans can do this, implying that like what they had said before was animals could do.
Well, it's also, I think the distinction there is like animals can imitate. Humans can sit and rationalize and think about it, but not only that, they can take it to the next level. They take the imitative qualities and they make something with it.
Right.
Which, I mean, obviously we can rationalize about things and a dog can't.
Yeah.
But that's one thing in Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. He says it all over the place, but specific at the beginning, talking about the idea of, he says, writing and world building like he does in Lord of the Rings, or people do in other works of fantasy. I think he actually used the word fantasy. He said it's sub-creation.
Mm-hmm.
So this artistic creation combining science or like knowledge or what was the other term we used for it? Reason, I guess. It was,
Ratio.
yeah, ratio, reason. Combining those things with the imitative, we're using our reason and then imitating what we see in nature by basically imitating God.
Right.
And so that produces the art, which is something that only humans can do because it's part of what makes us in God's image, is to be able to combine those two things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one thing I also wanted to ask you with that was what do you think, is there a difference between like an art and art?
How do you mean?
Like, so one thing that I've been thinking a lot recently is like, what is art? Or like what's like, because that's just
That's a
such a
very broad
confusing.
question.
I know, yeah, but like what counts as art? Like, at what point do you say that paint on a canvas is not actually art, or at what point do you say that these particular sounds don't count as art? But then the way that they talk about arts seem like they're more as like disciplines, like we've talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And so, kind of, what do you think is the distinction between an art being like a discipline and like a piece of art or a work of art? I guess not what's the distinction, but like, what are they're called the same. So why do they have the same name? What's the overlap there?
Is art like we would think of a painting? Is it the result of a discipline being applied?
Like like that which the art produces?
Yeah. The art is it's like the art of music or harmonia produces what we would also call music.
Right.
So the studying the art of music as far as relationships of notes and numbers and things like that can produce Bach's Brandenburg Concerto. And so...
Right. I think earlier in the book, they actually said what the arts are supposed to produce. The liberal arts are used to produce the works of reason. And the works of reason are like arguments, poems, and proofs are examples of works of reason.
So would those then be art?
I guess, but I feel like geometric proofs are in a different category than poems and paintings. For Aquinas, logic, rhetoric, and arithmetic and geometry are all a kind of work that is used to compile and justify the speculative sciences. He clarifies that these arts are not used to create physical products for the body, but instead to create knowledge from the soul. So the servile arts are supposed to produce physical things. So like blacksmithing would count as like a servile art.
Mm-hmm.
So the art of painting, I guess it would be different than a liberal art. But then that's kind of...
Because the difference in liberal versus the servile.
Right.
Okay.
And so because they're liberal because they're producing knowledge from the soul. And if, like, there's a freeing aspect in something with the soul.
This is where we need Mr. Wilbur.
Yeah, I know. This is where I get lost. But yeah, so I guess like works of art would be produced from the servile arts, but then what counts as a servile art? Because would servile arts still be joining imitation with reason? I guess they would. Because then there's something specific about what the liberal arts, what's their distinction between the liberal arts and this servile arts?
I do not remember. That was back in the introduction, wasn't it?
Yeah. It is the liberal arts alone whose good produced is knowledge, or in Aristotelian terms, science. So the liberal arts are distinguished by producing knowledge, whereas the servile arts produce physical things.
That seems to make sense.
Yeah.
So liberal arts produce knowledge. The servile arts, like you were saying, blacksmithing or painting, produce things.
Yeah. And so the servile arts are... So Aquinas says they're called liberal arts in order to distinguish them from those arts which are ordained to works done by the body, which arts are in a fashion servile, inasmuch as the body is in servile subjection to the soul, and man, as regards his soul, is free. So the body is subject to the soul, but our soul is free. And so the arts that deal with the soul are the freeing arts, because they strive towards knowledge and the freeing of the soul. And then the servile arts are with the body, because the body serves the soul.
Okay, yeah. I think that makes sense.
Yeah. And so I would say in the same way, the servile arts probably serve the liberal arts. And in order to... Well, okay, wait, what did that mean, though? I was about to go and then say, so you have to know the liberal arts to do the servile arts well, but I don't think that that's how that logic goes.
So you said the servile arts are subservient to the liberal arts?
I said that because they have servile in the name, but I don't know if that's actually how that works. I think like in the hierarchy of arts, they're lower because they're the servile ones versus the liberal, like the soul versus the body. In the same way that the body is like sort of hierarchically lower than the soul. Maybe, I don't actually know if that's true. That kind of feels weird.
I'm not actually sure on that one.
Yeah, I know. Because we're composite beings. We have a body and a soul. We're spiritual and physical. Augustine holds very strongly to the soul is not subject to the body in any way. And so the soul doesn't... It's like when he talks about like perception of music, specifically in De Musica, he talks about the soul doesn't like passively receive perception from the body. It like is actively making a memory of sense perception that's gotten from the body. So the soul is still active in the learning and the like making of memory, because he can't have the body being above the soul in any way. So I know Augustine at least thinks that way about the body and the soul.
I mean, that makes sense. Because it's like saying there's two parts of us and is one part greater than the other.
Yeah.
I mean, we're combined of both.
Right. But it is also the spiritual part of our being that connects us with God.
But God is also flesh.
Yeah, but we're not connected with God physically. God is flesh.
Well, what about communion? We
That's a good
partake of his
question.
flesh and his blood.
Yeah, but it's not like his actual flesh.
So
'Cause we're
you're
not
denying
Catholic. I
transubstantiation.
am denying transubstantiation.
But I mean, it is an interesting question, though.
It is interesting.
What does he mean then? We're also the church is the body of Christ. So you have this body language too, through which we're fed and are nurtured and grow.
But it's imagery. We're his
Yes.
body in a spiritual sense.
But even that way though, communion, we were given physical bread and wine that we eat with our physical bodies.
That's true.
That has to mean something. We commune
Right.
with him spiritually. We know we're called spiritually into his presence in heaven. But we're also physically fed at the same time at the table. So whether you believe transubstantiation or not, there's something physical going on there. Now, whether it's actually
Right.
his physical body or not, that's the debate we can have with the Catholics. But regardless, we're still eating something, and we're called and given this food every Sunday.
Right, but it has spiritual effects. It's a physical thing, but it's not the physical effects that actually like. It's not. There's nothing in the. Wait, okay, I gotta be careful with the way that I phrase this.
It's okay if you err; it's just heresy or something.
It's actually only heresy if you're shown the truth and you deny it. If you just make a mistake, it doesn't count as heresy. I learned that in theology class.
Okay, but setting that aside for now.
like the so communion is a means of grace, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I'm asking that as a question because I don't have like a full understanding of like sacraments and actually what they do. Uh, and by
I'm no
not full, I
seminary
mean
student.
like not very much. I'm asking you questions because you know more than me. But there are means of grace. But there's when you take communion, there's a physical thing going and a spiritual thing going on.
Mm-hmm.
And we need the physical thing to have the spiritual thing, but it's the spiritual thing that's actually the communication of the grace. Which is,
I mean, there's a physical element too.
Okay, yeah, but like it's how am I trying to say this? Like I'm not trying to separate them and say that the physical part is irrelevant because I'm not Gnostic. but like so what I was saying before with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
My initial point was it's our soul that connects us with God. And what I mean by that is if we didn't have a soul, if we were purely physical beings, we could not have the kind of relationship with God that we do. Like the
Okay.
personal relationship. Obviously there's a relationship because we're created to Creator.
But it says that he walked in the garden with Adam.
Yeah. But the Bible also says that God has arms and legs and hands, and he doesn't.
But then how does the angel of the Lord that visits Abraham is in a physical form, comes to him physically? So you have both this communication of he speaks to him spiritually, but then he also manifests himself physically before him and eats with him.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is that currently, like, yes, that happened. And in that moment, Abraham was connected with God in a physical way. But currently, right now, we don't have the angel of the Lord or, like, the incarnate Christ here with us to connect us with God in a physical way. Because his physical body is not on the planet.
I don't think we need it to be, though, for it to be physical. We're physically connected to him because he has become one of us. He's come down, he's dwelt among us, and he's taken on our fleshly substance himself. So in a sense, we are tied to him physically because he's made us brothers with him, both spiritually but also physically. He's taken on our flesh, and he's renewing us to be more like him.
That makes sense.
Spiritually and physically, because we know at the end we'll be raised body and soul.
Right.
But in a perfected state, more like him.
Mm-hmm. I think what I'm getting hung up on is that, like, when we pray and, like, actually, like, talk to God and, like, when we, like, our entire perception of our relationship with God is, with God as a person, is, it seems to be mostly spiritual. Because, like, there's, like, this is just a really complicated topic.
Yeah. But it is one, and like it can feel like this is pretty far removed from this that we've been talking about. And this, I'm holding up a book. I guess you can't see it if you're listening, but it feels like it could be pretty far removed from the book. But it kind of is the basis of understanding the Quadrivium. Is this Gnostic idea of the Greeks, the flesh is bad, and the spiritual is what we should go after, and the Christians coming along and saying no. We think the Greeks were onto something with this whole studying mathematics thing, but the flesh has to enter to it somewhere because we know God created it, pronounced it good originally, so it is good, and he himself became flesh, so it can't be something that's just worth abandoning.
Right.
So it really, this question of the physical and the spiritual, it is complicated, but it is also, I would argue, a big part of studying the liberal arts.
Yeah, because remember, like, the point of the liberal arts is to then move on to philosophy and theology.
Yeah.
And, like, ultimately the point of studying these things is virtue and knowledge of God. And so why would we be studying mathematics of the physical world in astronomy and music, I guess, because it's geometry and arithmetic are the abstract ones, right? Or no, music and arithmetic are the abstract ones. Geometry and
Yeah.
astronomy are the physical, or like the
Yeah.
concrete ones. Anyway, we study those, which are the physical world, for the purpose of knowing God more. So we can't just throw out the physical world entirely, like what you're saying.
Yeah. And as we're saying, it's a big topic. That
Yeah.
Obviously, in 45 minutes or whatever, we can't completely exhaust.
Yeah.
But
I also don't know very much, so I'm just kind of confused about a lot of things.
well, I mean, that's part of the point. Is
Right.
we don't know
gotta
a lot.
escape the cave.
We're trying to figure it out together and get somebody else to help us.
Yeah.
So anyway, after a long rabbit trail,
Yeah.
hopping over, I think we've kind of hit on some
Hopping.
geometry.
Like a rabbit. Sorry.
So anyway, hopping over to cosmology, I think some of the stuff we already hit on with geometry, we've gone over it before. We may hit on some of it again. But I really found interesting this idea they were talking about, and I didn't completely understand all of what they meant, but the idea of nominalism, I think is the name they gave it, but they were talking the idea of around the time of, was it Copernicus? They were saying people were more interested in the astronomy as idealizing it, kind of. It was just nice to think of them moving this way and understanding it that way.
Like the point was who could make a system that most accurately predicted the movements of the planets and the stars.
But not one that was
It wasn't
necessarily
like-
true.
Right. Not like what's an actual model for how these things move in relation to each other.
Okay.
Like it wasn't like here's an example of, or like a model of physically what's happening. It was here's a model that accurately predicts where these things will be in the sky. And so it was way more, they were going for just like mathematical precision versus an actual like explanation or cause for the physical world.
Okay, that helps because I was confused on what they meant.
Okay, yeah. So that was so nominalism was just worrying about like the name of it, I guess, kind of like what's his face, Pythagoras, Plato, one of the P Greek guys, told one of his, I think it was Pythagoras, and I think he told Eudoxus, who was like his top geometer or something, to save the appearances, which like refers to like, I think people have interpreted that as meaning essentially just making models or like recording the appearance of the thing. So this thing moves like this, so let's make a model that will predict how this thing moves. But just the appearance of it doesn't matter if it's actually the actual physicality of how it works.
So the interest had become more of, can I tell you when that star is going to appear, rather than do I actually understand how the stars work?
Yes. But then Copernicus and Kepler were much more into like mathematical realism or scientific realism, where they cared about how, like, what's actually happening out there past the moon. And so, but then that's kind of the guy, Osiander, I think, the guy who wrote the intro for Copernicus's book that I can't remember what it was called, something about a revolution, I think.
The Revolutionibus.
Yeah. Yes. He wrote the intro. And in the intro, then he presented it as like, so this is like kind of a good predictive model for how this works. And so everybody was kind of more okay with it because he wasn't saying the Earth is actually going around the sun. Because that was something that like people were going to freak out about when he said that. And so Osiander kind of, but Osiander was like trying to soften that a little bit and be like, this is just like a model that's not actually real. But Copernicus actually meant it to be this is how it actually works.
That's what they went on to say. But the reason they got angry with him was because he presented it as real, and he actually believed that it was real.
Right, with Galileo.
It was Galileo.
Because it wasn't
He was
Copernicus like died right when it was published, so he didn't actually
Yeah.
really get to see what happened with it. But Galileo actually, yeah, that was
and now
they
we
convicted
know
him
that
with
they were
believing
right.
it. Yeah.
All those people look like fools now.
Because that's what we're supposed to think about history.
Anyway,
Yep.
it was sarcasm.
Yes. Just in case that wasn't clear in our voice. And I thought it was cool. They made the point that students in high school today should explore the profound implications of this realist nominalist debate during their courses in mathematical science, which I thought was cool because that's what we did at New College.
Yeah.
But just kind of to understand understanding the development of thinking from ancient Greek astronomers all the way up until now.
Yeah.
Because that's like where the foundation. That's kind of one of the things they keep hitting on. It's like this is important because it's the foundational thing. And if you understand this thing, then you understand and you see how it moves into this other thing. And I thought it was super interesting how they were like nominalism, ancient Greeks, scientific revolution. You have Copernicus, Newton, and all those guys. Mathematical realism. But then it kind of went back into nominalism, and now you have people like Paul Dirac, who was the guy who discovered antimatter, I think, focusing on the beauty of the equation rather than like actually functionally what does this mean in reality.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
And so
we don't really concern ourselves with reality as much anymore. It's more of can we produce the result we want? Does it get us what we want mathematically? Okay, it does. Well, I don't care how you got there.
right. I mean, it's still like if we're dealing with like science of like mechanics or like at the atomic level or something, the math still needs to like fit with what's actually happening there.
Yeah.
But like kind of the focus being more shoot for trying to make mathematically beautiful like proportional equations and stuff rather than focusing on developing things and equations that work perfectly with how the world works, I guess.
Yeah.
Which is kind of similar to if we have something that describes it, as long as it's predictive of reality, it doesn't matter if it's actually explanatory.
Yeah. One thing I did want to say on it was before we move on, I wanted to say I've noticed because I've tried to kind of look back with my fourth grade class. I'm on year 2, but when we do astronomy, I've tried to start them back at the Greek understanding, and I've tried to almost do like a mini version of what we did with cosmology, but walk them up to, because I love astronomy, and it's one of the things that I feel like of all the sciences, it's the one that gets put on the back burner the most.
Yeah.
But I do think it's important for understanding a lot of other things, because as you said, they built up from that to what we notice or call science today.
Yeah.
Which is much more broad and studies a lot of other things. So I try to walk them through, this is where the Greeks started. This is why they found these things. This is how they found them. This is what they did with them, and this is how they kind of built up. And now, of course, we understand it differently. But I feel like, and I think to an extent it's helped them, especially this year as we're studying Greece and Rome. But even last year when we were studying Middle Ages and Renaissance, in that time period as well, it even helps kind of lay history in perspective, because it gives you understanding of the mindset of the time. So it helps you understand how the science progressed and even understand how we got it today. But I feel like it even helps you in a historical context understand even literature of the time. Because I mean, if I read Dante and I know, well, okay, it was about this time, this would have been their understanding of the cosmic order. Well, I can read that knowing more about his mindset of writing it, where he was coming from. And that helps me understand even his point then better. So I feel like there's a lot of reasons worth studying that.
Yeah.
And that we go into that for a long time, going on another rabbit trail. We don't have time for it, but
No. Only one rabbit trail per episode.
But I think that was about all I had for that section. If we want to skipping over to music.
Yeah.
I did have a question for you right off the bat. I was a little there. They had a quote here from Werner Heisenberg.
Mm-hmm.
He's a quantum physicist. I was a little confused as to what he meant. It was modern physics has definitely decided in favor of Plato. In fact, the smallest units of matter are not physical objects in the ordinary sense. They are forms and ideals which can be expressed unambiguously only in mathematical language.
Yeah.
I was a little confused as to what he was trying to say.
I think right there he's referring to how this like the smallest units of matter, like at the quantum level, so like whatever, like quarks, and I feel like there might be one smaller, but I don't remember what it is. But like electrons and stuff like that, all of these like super tiny things that we can't actually see. They're really not physical objects in the ordinary sense. Like electrons, we like have like there's like the, I think it's the Bohr model of the atom where you have like the nucleus and then you have the orbits of the electrons going around it, but they don't actually orbit. They just kind of like shoot from one side to the other, and they're here and now they're over here, and like all over you have the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is something about like once you've observed a particle, then it's no longer going to
Behave the same way.
Yes. And I think also like the way they move, you can't actually know exactly where it is at any given point, or like what the direction that it's moving. And as soon as you've observed it, then it's going to change. Or like observing the particle itself affects the way that it moves and works. I think it's something kind of in that general area of uncertainty. And so it's not like the uncertainty principle is a mathematical thing. I think.
Yeah.
Or like it's related. And so I think that's what he means, is that they're not physical objects in the ordinary sense, because observing them doesn't change how they operate. And it's not like we kind of can only predict what they are and how they are with probability, because in the quantum realm everything is super wacky. And like
I saw Ant-Man.
Yeah, so then they can only be expressed. There are forms and ideas which can be expressed unambiguously only in mathematical language. So everything that I just explained that with was kind of ambiguous.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't speaking in math. But we can describe all those things very specifically with actual math.
Okay.
And I think that's what he's talking about there.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay. Cool.
So then they open up talking about the three divisions of music, which is we don't normally think of music this way now. We have the music instrumentalis, musica humana, and musica mundana. He says the first one is what we normally think of as music. It's the heard melodies, orchestras, instruments, and all that.
Yeah.
But then moving on to the other ones, musica mundana represented the proportionalities woven into the world, and the musica humana reflected the mathematical proportionalities that exist in the person and in human society. So,
yeah. So we just read this whole thing, music on
Harmonia.
Yes, in Harmonia. Sorry. They actually reference it in the book. Catherine Pickstock's article, "Music, Soul, City, and Cosmos After Augustine," from the book Radical Orthodoxy: A New Theology. We just read just like that chapter, and it was really crazy, and I didn't actually understand half of the words that she said, and that's partially because a lot of the concepts were way over my head, and also because she used a lot of unnecessary big words for things, which is slightly frustrating. But that's also just because I think her audience is super academic. Anyway, she talked about that, and it was super cool the way she phrased the musica humana as like the proportions of the soul to the body, and the proportions within the soul itself and within the body itself, and then also proportions of the person to the world, and like person to person. I also thought the quote by Leibniz, I'm not really sure exactly how it's supposed to be pronounced, co-founder of calculus, said, "Music is the joy that a soul takes in counting without realizing it." And that just kind of made me happy.
Yeah, I love that quote. The idea of, like, of counting without realizing it. Because I mean, I was even thinking this, like, yesterday before church started. We had and during class time we had a psalm sing where we sat around. We were practicing different songs that we sing sometimes regularly or haven't sung in a while, and then a new one to kind of grow our repertoire.
Mm-hmm.
And then even this morning in assembly at school, just catching myself as I'm singing, kind of tapping my foot or
Yep.
kind of tapping my knee as I'm singing. I'm not even aware I'm doing it. I mean, it's mathematical. You
Yeah.
get that 1, 2, 3, 4. And I remember one of them was a lot of eighth notes. So it wasn't even. It was you weren't even always on the beat with the bass line, but still sitting there and I'm counting it without even realizing I'm counting the beats.
Right.
And that's what I thought of when I read that this afternoon. I was like, that is music.
Yeah.
You're doing math without realizing you're doing math.
Yeah.
Which is part of what has made me love math more, is because I love music, and then realizing this is also math.
Yeah.
And there's apparently some level of math that I'm actually interested in studying.
Yeah. Was there anything else in this section that you wanted to talk about?
The only other thing I had here was, he says, in other words, the liberal art of music was the end of education, which identified the harmonious composition of all reality with the prior stage of the musical education, and the learning of the heard harmonies prepared the way. It seems they also would kind of agree music seems to be kind of the higher end of it, kind of culminating the other ones together. But you're studying the beauty and the harmony and the relationship of everything, kind of tying it together here at the end.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say on the next page, he says, what is striking is that Kepler is ostensibly doing astronomy. He called it music, harmony of the world.
Yeah.
So Kepler's doing astronomy, but is understanding it, even as Mr. Wilber's explaining it to us, in terms of harmony in music. It's studying the relationship and the proportion of the math in these heavenly bodies and elsewhere in nature. But we can understand it through the lens of music and the relationships that we find there.
Yeah.
Because the cosmos moves on the same principles.
Yes.
Which I would argue is evidence of a divine creator.
Yeah.
Because it all works off of the same math.
Yeah. And the way that so Carol Harrison, in her book on music, sense, affect, and voice, the way that she translates Augustine's definition of music is that music is the art of measuring well. And
I like that.
yeah. And so she expounds on that in the book. But then I thought that was super cool, paired with Pickstock in her
Like you
article.
said, Pixar.
Pixar. Yeah, in Pixar when they're talking about the liberal arts. But Pickstock in her article that I was talking about earlier about music, she defines the quadrivium as the measuring arts. And I don't remember exactly how she lays it out, but she kind of she describes each of them in terms of like being measurements. And so that paired with the art of measuring well being music, I think is super cool, and also kind of points to music being the final ultimate culmination of the quadrivium, because you've learned these different measuring arts, and then music, harmonia, is the art of measuring well.
Yeah.
And so it's similar to like rhetoric with the trivium, is like you learn these language skills kind of, and then rhetoric is how to use them well and actually present them.
Yeah.
In a way that's actually...
It combines the other two together, and then it is his own thing in addition.
Yeah, and it's like doing those things well. Kind of, and like for good, kind of, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't think about rhetoric that way. But yeah, it is, in a sense, it is kind of measuring the two that came before it.
Yeah.
Well, I believe that brings us to the end of our time for today. Hopefully today's episode doesn't end up being too much longer than normal. But as always, we will have a synopsis up on our blog of this episode, which if you're here, you may have already found that. But please feel free to leave us comments there. We went on many rabbit trails today, said many things that could be controversial.
Yep.
We could be wrong.
I may have said something really stupid and not realized.
If we have committed heresy, please let us know.
Yes.
But also, if there's any other feedback you would like to provide us in the comments there, please, we welcome it. Leave it for us. Helps us to continue to grow. Hopefully helps others as well.
Mm-hmm.
So leave us a comment there if there's anything. But if not, till next time, take care.